Greetings. My name is Sherry Griffith, and welcome to Assessments in Health and Physical Education. This webinar will cover assessments in the health classroom, in the PE classroom, whether virtually or whether hybrid or face-to-face. As teachers, we decide what strategies we'd like to use to assess our students. This decision can be based on factors related to the learner's needs, the maximizing of instructional time, or even what suits our varying learning environments. It's important to differentiate assessments, just as we know it's important to differentiate instruction. Differentiating assessment strategies includes, but is not limited to, teacher observation, performance, participation, checks, grades, formal or informal assessments, whether in a virtual, face-to-face, or hybrid learning environments. As teachers, assessments should drive our instruction. Assessments let us know what our students know and what they don't know, and give us an idea of how we can move forward, making the teaching and learning experience the best it could possibly be. Here's a picture of my class chat during one of my virtual professional learning sessions. I asked a question during class and observed the chat responses. This gave me an indication of my scholars' perspectives, possible misconceptions, and an idea of who was actively participating. Observing also helped me to clarify details, helped me to alter instruction based on learners' needs, and served as an appropriate tool for assessing an opening question. You've just landed on my Jamboard. Jamboard is a Google app that can be used so many different ways. I use this Jamboard to observe student responses. On this Jamboard, I asked the question, how did engaging students look in your classroom? This past school year, how many of you had a classroom that looked like this? Students were directed to put their names on a sticky note and place the sticky note on the Jamboard frame if they agreed that their classroom looked like mine did in the picture. This enabled me to observe student responses and to assess what they have experienced prior to coming into my learning environment. Students were able to place as many responses that applied to them to evaluate themselves based on their own prior knowledge and evaluate their peers by comparison. For my middle school students, this challenges my scholars to understand that different answers from their peers are okay, and being assessed or evaluated transparently can help them to learn from one another. This Jamboard activity asked numerous questions which required the students to evaluate themselves while the teacher observed to assess the students. The students clicked the link in the chat and had access to the assessment. I use this assessment strategy in the virtual or hybrid health or PE class because students like the colorful sticky notes and enjoy maneuvering around one another. Sometimes instead of using sticky notes, students can write in text boxes or upload images using the toolbar on the left side of the Jamboard. Sometimes my virtual students cannot unmute their mics or do not like to speak or collaborate with others. If they were face-to-face, this would be a requirement. This assessment is a user-friendly way to include all students with access to my Jamboard link. In my PE class, I differentiate the FitnessGram flexibility test based on learner needs. My students need their class time to be maximized. They only have 9 weeks with me before they are no longer in my class and have a different teacher. Sometimes I have an average of 40 students in my class and share the learning environment with other classes. Sometimes materials such as the Sit and Reach box is unavailable to scholars. In these circumstances, teacher observation maximizes instructional time and still serves as an appropriate instructional and assessment tool. This past school year, students were tasked with evaluating their own fitness gram assessments. Differentiating assessments for my students was very important because their needs were so diverse. I performed the shoulder stretch live in our virtual setting. Many students volunteered to evaluate themselves on camera because the assessment consisted of only being observed. Students could observe themselves to see if their fingers touch. This encouraged them to actively participate, whether on camera or not. Observing students is the least invasive way, in my opinion, to assess students and to help decrease the discomfort that tends to accompany assessments. Sometimes scholars are assessed through asynchronous learning activities. Students complete asynchronous learning activities independently. Because students are completely independent, asynchronous activities are usually assessed informally to monitor student performance. Assessing student performance is appropriate and applicable in a face-to-face, virtual, or in a hybrid learning environment. Rubrics such as these are called self-assessment tools and aid in the facilitation of student-centered and self-directed learning. They place responsibility on the learner to obtain the most points, maximize their own achievement, and promote self-evaluation skills. I provide students with performance-based assessments, whether face-to-face or virtual. The criteria for performing successfully is clarified for students, as well as the evaluation tool. In this task, students assess their own ability to influence others to have good social health in any location they chose. They were tasked to name and describe a location, both verbally and non-verbally, using imagery and text, and to advocate the promotion of positive health choices by influencing their audience to behave appropriately in the setting they chose. In my class, performance assessments empower my learners to maximize their own achievement. In this presentation, my scholar chose the PlayStation 4 as a place to promote positive health choices and behavior expectations for his peers. He influenced proper etiquette and safety practices, which are very important to the health of his peers. My favorite thing about performance-based assessments is that it meets the learner right where they are. In this presentation, my student was able to influence proper etiquette and safety practices for his peers. He provided verbal and nonverbal communication as the task required and directed himself throughout his performance based on his own knowledge and his own abilities. Assessments in the health and physical education classroom also includes participation. One way to assess participation, whether virtually or face-to-face, is by playing Kahoot. Kahoot is a game that quizzes scholars through multiple choice questions. These questions can pop up live on the screen to assess the whole group, or a link can be dropped in the chat to assess scholars independently. In my face-to-face health or PE class, and in my virtual and hybrid classes, I assess students as they participate in playing Kahoot. I create the assessment on the Kahoot website and assess student responses during gameplay. This is a participation assessment because they receive a grade based on participating, no matter if their answers were right or wrong. As a teacher, I use the assessment to evaluate what students know or what I may need to reteach. My students love Kahoot so much. It's a self-directed learning activity. I assess students after they play a Kahoot. I drop the link in the chat. I also drop the game pin, and students participate in Kahoot independently. I then go to the Kahoot website to obtain the results of the assessment. This is what it looks like when I go to the Kahoot website to evaluate my students' participation while being assessed playing Kahoot. I only receive the results of the assessment. Differentiating assessments through participation in PE class face-to-face is similar in the aspect that the assessment grade is based on if the student got in place and went through the motion of participating. This assessment is a strategy used during the Fitness Grand Pacer test. Scholars participate in being assessed and data is recorded, but a grade is not given based on performance. Students who line up and participate in the assessment are evaluated by a facilitator who does not interfere or use questions to prompt student responses. There is no grading rubric, but only a score given for the data collection process and a grade earned for effort. Assessing students by checking is another way to informally assess students. When I was student teaching, my professor told us, only check homework. Anyone could have done that homework for little Johnny. Learn what you can from little Johnny's assessments. Checking is a teacher observation with a grade. Checking is different than teacher observation or participation, because students have requirements that are minimal, and teachers may interact with the students to enhance the student performance while the student is being assessed. In this video, the student is required to run or jog around the cones. If the student does not travel around the cones, the observing facilitator can cue the student to correct this aspect of their performance. If the student makes the mistake again of not traveling around the cones, the teacher can check off during the assessment that the scholar participated but did not meet the criteria of traveling around the cones. This assessment is less formal than grading, but more formal than teacher observation, in which the teacher only assesses to measure for his or her own knowledge, and more formal than participation, which places accountability on the student for going through the motions, but has less accountability for the scholar than grading. Checking for understanding has criteria for the student to be assessed on. and they should be aware of this criteria to be given the opportunity to be assessed fairly. In my PE class, I share the standard with the students. The student is provided with an opportunity to gain understanding and then be assessed to determine or check for understanding. During the particular activity, my students understood that they should be able to identify concepts that combine movements that are highlighted for them, which include running, jumping, pivoting, and changing speed and direction. After learning the criteria of the assessment highlighted for them, students learn the concepts during instruction. As the facilitator, I provide an engaging activity for my scholars and then the task. The task for this activity requires the scholars to identify which activity in the challenge includes all concepts that were highlighted: running, jumping, pivoting, changing speed, and changing direction. Checking for understanding is a student-centered assessment in which the student is accountable for the grade they receive. Teacher observation is an informal assessment that has no grade. Participation has a grade. It's also informal, but the only requirement is effort for data collection and to evaluate how teaching and learning can be improved upon. Checking for understanding is more informal than the previous assessment strategies because of the accountability and responsibility placed on the learner and because it requires higher levels of understanding on the part of the learner. We're back on my Jamboard. I use this Jamboard to assess students by checking whether or not they could identify 6 physical activities that could be performed safely in this parking lot. Students use the sticky note feature on Jamboard to section off and label the parking lot. This activity's criteria required teamwork because no one could repeat responses. This activity required sportsmanship because there was no cheating allowed, and every individual student had to support the team by participating. And this activity required students to be able to identify physical activities that could be performed safely with minimal space. The police created the outer boundaries on the playing field, and all activities had to be conducted on the outside perimeter of the gas pumps. Scholars were assessed on their participation, as well as being able to identify physical activities that could be conducted in small spaces safely. Grades are formal assessments that require students to be assessed on criteria and not by participation or checking. Grades assess similarly to performance assessments because scholars are assessed based only on criteria. However, they may or may not receive a rubric or an assessment tool. In my PE class, students may be assessed and receive a grade based on their ability. As a facilitator, I only assess. While being graded, students are not always provided with a tool to measure themselves. Although I am observing and checking, and students are participating and performing, the assessment is formal. I will not help the scholar. I will only evaluate, and the percentage of the credit they receive has more weight than when they were participating and being checked. Students should know they are being graded and understand that they should strive for their highest achievement levels. This is not practice, but considered similar to a quiz or a test. The facilitator should prepare graded assessments to evaluate fairly based on learner differences. This means that the facilitator checked for understanding and provided the learner with remediation opportunities before grading them. And if a physical or mental disability inhibits student achievement, the facilitator has made adjustments to accommodate the scholar. In my PE class or my health class, I most likely provided the student with an assessment tool before assessments as a poster or in a prior activity. Or I would empower my scholars with the assessment tool during the assessment. I do this to promote responsible lifelong learning habits, self-directed learners, and to facilitate a student-centered learning environment. This graded activity is from my health class. Scholars receive a choice board with numerous activities to choose from. This choice board enables scholars to choose between mental emotional health, social health, or physical health activities. After clicking on a button, students land on an activity. Sometimes students land on a link that takes them to an activity that has multiple steps for them to complete. Students who click on a physical health activity may land on a screen that takes them to an activity that looks like this. In this graded activity, there is no assessment tool. Students are directed to choose 3 activities from the choice board and then afterwards to complete the form survey using the link provided. In this graded health assessment, the first criteria to be met is choosing 3 of 6 activities to participate in. I cannot observe, check, or prompt students. This part of the assessment is independent. The second criteria to be met by students is to click the link and complete the response page or answer sheet to be graded. This part of the formal assessment is independent also. In my class, I use forms to grade my students' assessments. Forms is a Google app and also a Microsoft app. I use the Microsoft app. The following instructional video will show you how the app grades assessments for teachers. I will now show you how to use an app called Forms. This is a nice way that we can assess our students. It's very simple. I've heard in the Google Classroom that they call Forms self-grading quizzes. Yes, self-grading quizzes. And so I'm going to show you how this works. We would actually go to our Office 365 and we would select Forms. And so we can start a new form or a new quiz. I'm going to start a new quiz. And right here I can see all the forms that I've made before. For example, this one. Would you like the students to grade? Would you like for student work to grade itself? I sent this out to a class and I got responses. And when I looked at the responses, I could see how long it took the students. It took them on average 38 seconds. For each question, it gave me a pie chart. Out of all of these students, 39 of them would like student work to grade itself. 2 of them
said no, 3 said maybe. Would you like if the graded student work had correlating pie charts? Some of them said maybe, most of them said yes. And so you can see the data, and it came with a pie chart just by me clicking responses. And I can see this information, but even what's even greater about this is when I review the results, I can open this in Excel, and it gives me an Excel sheet. And on this Excel sheet, when I click view results, I can see the person's name and see each individual person's results in that form. But when I click open in Excel, please open in Excel. And when I click open in Excel, it actually gives me an Excel document. And so I can see my students' names, I can see their email addresses, I can see the date and the time and the actual answers they put. And so this is just extremely helpful. I can see the answers they put for every question. And again, I can see their name, the date, the time, their email. So this is pretty great for me to get this and look at this and see who participated, just to do a quick check as far as differentiating assessments. I can check like this by just creating a form and sending out some questions. I can even use this while I'm in Teams, and it will send a poll. It will send this into the chat. This comes with its own web address once I'm creating it, and I can share this. So I'm going to actually go back to forms and show you how to create a form. Starting with new form, you give the form a name, you add a question. The question can be a multiple choice question. It could be a fill in the blank question. It could be thumbs up, thumbs down, or how effective was this training session. I could send this to you and you can give me 5 stars, 1 star, whatever you'd like. And I would see, I can add a question. Let's add one more. It can be text. And you can answer your how could this session be improved? And so you could actually send this to your students, and it can actually be a more explicit questioning than just multiple choice. And the students can actually give you your answers, and you would get the response in the Excel sheet with their typed out answers. And so when sharing this quiz, you have the opportunity before you share it to do a number of things. You can go into the settings and you can decide who can fill this out. If anyone can fill this out, you can't get the same data. So you want to put only people who are in my organization that I've sent it to. You can create a start time, an end time. You can make sure that you get an email notification once it's turned in. You can make sure that people only give one response. So once they turn their response in, they can't turn in another one. And you can even send a thank you note. Your response was submitted. Thank you for participating. I can even add an emoji if I want. And so these things are very helpful. You click share and you actually receive a link. This link is ready for me to paste. I can copy this link. I clicked copy, and then I can actually email this link out, paste it onto my slide presentation, insert text box, Control V, and the form is here. It's not highlighted, so I want to make sure that I actually have it highlighted. I'm going to go back to my form. I'm going to make sure I have copied this link. It let me know I got a notification. It's ready for me to paste. And so I'm going to come right here and I'm going to paste that again to make sure it's pasted, even though I know it was pasted and they can actually access the link. There it is. And so anyone who comes to this link will go to my form and be able to take this survey. To complete. Just that simple. And once they click submit, I will get my responses, and the student or whoever's taking it can also get their responses sent to them. This is a great app, a tool that's right here in your Outlook for you waiting. It's a lot of great apps here for you to use. And I hope this information was helpful, for this is a great way to help differentiate your assessments.
I hope you enjoyed our webinar, Assessments in Health and Physical Education. Please visit the Georgia Department of Education community website at community.gadoe.org for more helpful tips to collaborate, connect, share thoughts, or resources for teachers and administrators. Thank you for viewing, and we hope you enjoyed our webinar.